By midnight, the lane looked almost unreal. Red bulbs trembled above cracked door frames. Rainwater dragged cigarette ash through the gutters. Cheap perfume fought with the smell of mold, diesel, sweat, and old despair. Men came and went with their collars up and their eyes lowered, as if shame became invisible when it walked fast enough. On both sides of the narrow street, women leaned beneath broken neon signs, painted mouths, tired wrists, borrowed dresses. Some laughed too loudly, some had already stopped pretending. Among them stood Mira. At first glance, she looked like the others. The district had swallowed heels dark with mud, lipstick carefully repaired in the reflection of a dusty window, silence arranged on her face like armor. But there was something in her eyes that had not gone dead. Not hope exactly. Hope was too luxurious for a place like this. It was something harder, a private refusal. The stubborn, dangerous decision not to let filth become identity. The men who controlled the lane hated that look, especially Raghav Sethi. He was not the kind of trafficker people imagined in stories. He did not shout in public. He did not swagger. He wore pressed shirts, clean watches, and the patient expression of a businessman who believed every human weakness could be priced. Years ago, he had found Mira when she was young, frightened, and far from home. A false job, a locked room, one vanished passport, one beating severe enough to teach the lesson. By the time she understood what had been taken from her, her name no longer seemed to belong to her own mouth. To Raghav, that was the method. Break the future first. The body followed easily after that. And yet Mira had developed a habit that unsettled him. She watched everything. Who owed money? Which girl limped after clients left? Which child slept behind the tea stall because no one was coming back for him? Which woman hid bruises under bangles and called it normal? Mira moved through the district, like someone counting damage no one else intended to remember. That night, a small boy crouched under the torn awning outside the liquor shop, hugging his knees against the rain. He could not have been older than 7. One slipper, no jacket, eyes already learning the blank stare of the abandoned. Mira stopped. A madam from the next doorway clicked her tongue. Leave him. If he stays here long enough, someone will use him or sell him, same as always. Mira looked at the child, then at the muddy coins in her own hand. The thin remains of another night survived. Not always, she said. The woman laughed at that. In a place like this, mercy sounded almost obscene, but Mira crossed the lane anyway. She crouched in the rain, pressed the coins into the tea seller's palm, and said, "Feed him, and if he's still here tomorrow, I'll come back." Above them, the red lights kept flickering. Behind her, Raghav watched from the balcony of the second floor, one hand resting on the rail, his face unreadable. To him, women like Mira were inventory, temporary, finished, useful, only until time or violence hollowed them out completely. He did not yet understand the danger of a soul that had been dragged into the mud and still found a reason to protect something smaller than itself. That was the beginning of the story. Not the night she was ruined, the night she decided ruin would not be the final language of her life. By daylight, the district looked worse. Night at least gave it shadows. Morning exposed everything. Torn curtains hung in open windows. Makeup-streaked water ran along the curb. The women who had smiled for strangers only hours before now sat outside on plastic chairs with swollen feet, chipped bangles, and the empty stare of people returning from a place they had never chosen to go. Mira learned early that survival in such a place depended on division. One part of you stood under the red lights. Another part had to go somewhere else. Most women sent that hidden part of themselves into numbness, some into bitterness, some into prayer. Mira sent hers into counting. Coins first, then folded notes, then tiny amounts tucked into impossible places, inside a torn mattress seam, beneath a loose bathroom tile, stitched into the hem of an old shawl no one would think to steal. She did not save with the fantasy of rescue anymore. That dream had nearly killed her once. No, this was something colder, more disciplined. She was building an exit that did not depend on mercy. What changed her was not one grand revelation. It was accumulation. A girl of 14 arriving and pretending not to cry. A woman coughing blood into a sink and still being sent back to work. A child sleeping beside crates near the alley because his mother had disappeared 3 nights ago and no one asked where. The district did not only consume women, it bred abandoned children like a second harvest. Mira saw them everywhere now. Barefoot boys dodging drunk men, thin girls carrying tea glasses with the reflexes of servants and the eyes of prey. Children learning too early that danger had footsteps, breath, and bargaining power. One afternoon, she returned with stale bread and found the same small boy from the rain, squatting near the tea stall, tracing shapes in the dirt with a broken spoon. He looked up cautiously when she approached, ready to run. "You came back," he said. Mira handed him the bread. "I said I would." He took it like someone accepting proof that the world had briefly broken one of its own rules. That stayed with her all evening. Later, when the rooms filled and the corridor lights dimmed, Mira sat before a cracked mirror while another woman pinned up her hair. The mirror was so old, it had begun to cloud at the edges, swallowing faces before returning them. "Why do you still bother?" the woman asked quietly. "With what?" "With looking at those children like they matter." Mira met her own reflection. Powder over fatigue, color over grief, a face prepared for purchase. "Because someone should," she said. The woman gave a sad, knowing smile. "This place turns everything it touches into dirt." Mira lowered her eyes and smoothed the cheap fabric over her knees. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, almost to herself, she answered, "Only if you leave it there." That was the first time the truth formed clearly inside her. Pain could rot, or it could be repurposed. The same fire that blackened a life could also harden it into something the fire had not intended to create. She could not undo what had been done to her. She could not wash this district out of her memory, or give back the years stolen in locked rooms and false names. But perhaps suffering was not the end of a soul's usefulness. Perhaps it could be melted down, reshaped, turned toward protection, not escape, transmutation. That night, while the house above her hummed with transactions and muffled laughter, Mira counted her hidden money again. It was still small, still fragile, still laughable against the scale of what had been taken from her. But for the first time, it had a purpose large enough to outlive her shame. Not freedom for herself alone. A place, a room, a roof, where children from these streets could sleep before the district learned their names. And somewhere down the corridor, behind a half-closed office door, Raghav glanced at his ledgers and saw only numbers. He never noticed that one of the women he considered finished had already begun turning his cruelty into the foundation of something he would one day stand helpless before. The first room Mira ever paid for was smaller than a storage closet. It stood behind an aging chapel at the edge of the old market, far from the red light lane but not far enough to forget it. The plaster on the walls had peeled in pale curls. The roof leaked in 2 corners during rain. A rusted fan trembled overhead like it was praying not to die. To anyone else, it looked like a useless place. To Mira, it looked like interruption. A child could sleep there and not be seen. That was enough to begin. The arrangement came through Sister Agnes, a widow-voiced woman who ran the chapel kitchen and asked very few questions. Mira had found her months earlier while bringing leftover food wrapped in newspaper for 2 alley boys who had started lingering near the district after dark. Sister Agnes understood the sort of women the city preferred not to see. She did not offer pity. She offered lists. Rice, soap, old school books with names scratched out on the first page. So Mira built slowly, one hidden payment at a time, one child at a time, one act small enough not to attract notice. Money that had passed through humiliation became blankets, fees, medicine, shoes without holes in them. She learned how to stretch every note until it stopped looking like currency and started looking like shelter. The district still took from her night after night, but now part of what it took returned elsewhere in another form. Quieter, cleaner, alive. Years moved that way. Not dramatically, not mercifully, just steadily. The room behind the chapel became 2 rooms, then a narrow upstairs hall with 6 iron beds, then a courtyard patched with broken tile where children studied under a strip of afternoon light. Some came half wild with suspicion, some came silent. Some stole food the first week and hid it under their mattresses, because trust always arrived later than hunger. Mira never called it an orphanage aloud. That word sounded too official. too vulnerable to people who loved paperwork more than children. She called it the house. The children called it home. Among them was a boy named Arjun. He arrived thin as wire, carrying a torn plastic bag, and the habit of flinching whenever an adult moved too quickly. He said little in the beginning, but his eyes missed nothing. He read signboards in the street before he had proper notebooks. He finished borrowed books and asked for harder ones. When the others slept, he sat under the corridor bulb, tracing letters onto scrap paper, with a concentration so fierce, it looked almost like anger. Mira noticed. "Why are you still awake?" she asked one night. Arjun glanced up, startled. "I don't want to forget the words." She stood there for a moment, one hand resting on the chipped door frame. "Then don't." After that, she began setting aside extra money for his schooling. Quietly, fees paid through Sister Agnes. Uniform mended twice over. Exam forms submitted before deadlines. Arjun never knew how many nights had financed a single textbook. He only knew that whenever the path narrowed, it opened again. As he grew, he became the kind of boy teachers remembered. Not charming, not polished, serious, precise, the sort who listened as if truth was something fragile and expensive. Once, after winning a district essay prize, he brought the certificate back to the house and stood awkwardly in the courtyard while the younger children cheered. Mira took the paper from his hand and read it slowly. "You'll go far," Sister Agnes said. Arjun shook his head. "Only if I keep working." Mira looked at him then with an expression he did not yet know how to name. It was not pride exactly. It was something deeper. The look of someone watching proof emerge from suffering. That night, walking back through the city toward the district, Mira passed polished storefronts, clean families, restaurants full of people who had never once imagined the price of another person's ruin. Her heels were muddy from the roadside. Her body ached with the familiar tax of survival. But inside her, something remained untouched. A house now stood where there had been nothing. A future was studying under its roof, and far away, in his careful office, Raghav still believed the women he had broken left nothing behind but damage. He did not know that one of them had begun raising judgment in a courtyard of cracked tile and evening light. Raghav Sethi aged the way corrupt men often do, expensively. His hair silvered at the temples. His suits became softer, darker, more discreet. He stopped visiting the district himself years ago and began speaking the language of distance. Logistics, placements, recruitment chains, overseas arrangements. Evil matured into paperwork. It always thought that made it respectable, but time had weakened his instincts. A girl escaped from one of his newer routes, then another. A driver was arrested. A ledger surfaced. Names long buried inside hotel records, transit slips, and shell companies began connecting like veins beneath the skin. What had once been hidden inside fear was now moving toward court. When the summons finally arrived, Raga read it twice and smiled. He had survived worse, he thought. Men with money rarely feared truth. They feared inconvenience. Cases could be delayed. Witnesses could be discredited. Women from districts like those had no standing in the eyes of the world. By the time the law finished with them, they usually looked guilty simply for having survived. That was still the arithmetic he trusted. The courtroom, on the morning of his first hearing, was cool and white and almost offensively clean. Marble floors, wooden benches polished by years of waiting, ceiling fans turning with old institutional patience. Radhav stood there in a tailored suit, cufflinks catching light, wearing the calm expression of a man who believed the room would eventually remember his class. Then the judge entered, Justice Arjun Mehra. He was younger than Raghav expected, though not young enough to be dismissed. His face held that rare quality some men acquire only after wrestling with difficult truths for a long time. A stillness that did not need to perform authority because it had already earned it. He took his seat, adjusted the case file, and began. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Dates were read, charges stated, counsel noted appearances. The machinery of law moved as it always did, deliberate, unsentimental, precise. Then a supporting file was passed forward from the prosecution table, a charitable trust, old property records, a sequence of quiet donations made over many years through an intermediary attached to a chapel in the old market. The funds had helped support a children's residence that later became a registered educational home. Several names emerged from that house. One of them was now on the bench. Arjun's hand paused on the page, only for a second. But in court, 1 second is enough to change the air. He read further. A name attached to the earliest contributions, not the public alias the district had used. The older one, the buried one, Mira. For a long moment, he said nothing. Somewhere in the second row sat a woman in a plain sari, posture straight despite the years written softly at the corners of her eyes. She did not lean forward, did not seek recognition. In that vast white room, she looked almost small until one understood what had passed through her hands. Arjun looked up, their eyes met, and in that silence, 2 lives touched their hidden origin. He remembered the first textbooks that had appeared when none could be afforded, the exam fees mysteriously covered, the school shoes left outside his door before monsoon. Sister Agnes, years ago, saying only, "Some debts are paid forward, not back." Raghav followed the direction of the judge's gaze and saw her. He frowned first in confusion, then in recognition so cold it almost looked like sickness. Not because Mira had survived. Men like him always knew survival was possible in the most technical sense. What he had never imagined was consequence with posture, consequence with a legal nameplate, consequence seated above him in robes, formed partly by the life he had tried to grind into anonymity. For the first time since the proceedings began, his face changed. Not dramatically, just enough, a tiny fracture at the mouth, a draining around the eyes, the expression of a man discovering that history had not forgotten him after all. The hearing continued. It had to. Law was not theatre. Arjun's voice, when he spoke again, was steady, but something larger than procedure had entered the room. Raghav was no longer facing accusation alone. He was standing inside the return of his own work. Every child neglected, every woman erased, every future he had priced and shipped and buried. It had not vanished. At least one fragment of it had been gathered, fed, educated, and raised into judgment. Mira did not smile. That mattered. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching not like a victor, but like someone finally witnessing the end of a sentence that had begun years earlier in a locked room. No triumph, no performance, only completion. When the session ended and officers moved around Raga, he looked back once more, not at the judge, at her. And what he saw was the one thing his kind never knows how to survive. A human being he had called ruined standing, quietly beyond his reach, carrying more moral authority than all the money he had ever worn. Outside, the marble steps shone under the afternoon sun. Mira descended them slowly, her old heels leaving faint traces of mud from the street below. Ahead of her, the city opened wide and bright. Behind her, inside the white chamber of the court, the machinery of law continued its patient work. Lead had become gold, and the man who had once trafficked in broken lives was finally learning that some souls do not remain where they are thrown. They rise, they build, and one day they return as judgment.